how Chicago got involved in this. We had some high-profile fires in the city of Chicago, and I'm sure you've had yours as well, right? The ones that get attention, right? The ones that people start paying attention to. In particular, 69 West Washington Street. That was the Cook County building fire. You may have heard of that. 6 people were found in the stairwell. Well after the fire was under control, we were picking up companies. Very embarrassing kind of situation. Very high-profile fire, right? Made us stand up and pay attention, right? In essence, we rewrote our entire high-rise SOP because of that fire, right? And in the course of doing that, we started to reach out to other cities, New York, Philadelphia, LA, San Francisco, Phoenix, Dallas, right? Asking for information. We found out that a lot of these departments, they already had their high-profile event, right? They already had their wake-up call. So they rewrote theirs. Why didn't we see that, right? Because the information doesn't get out, it doesn't get shared. And that's what we're going to try to change. Ever heard this statement before? Smoke spread is the biggest problem in high-rise fires. I remember hearing that probably the first day I came on the job. What do we do about it? What do we do about it? Could anybody tell me? Do you ventilate? Do you open the stairwells? Do you open the bulkheads? Do you take out the windows? Or no? High-rise buildings are very complex buildings. Exceedingly complex buildings. And one of the things we learned from these projects working with NIST was we're going to rewrite our entire ventilation operation for operating in high-rise buildings. All right? There's a lot of good information out there on fighting fires in high-rise buildings, and if you look at it real carefully, most of it is talking about the water issue. Water supply, search, getting water on the fire, all important things. When it comes to the ventilation, very little is said because very little is understood. We've got a long way to go in the understanding of ventilation and how smoke movement and ventilation works in high-rise buildings if we're going to make a difference.
1980. 89 was the next fire, and that was Horace Harding Expressway in Queens. There were some civilians actually rescued at that particular fire, and one of the rescues was made by a firefighter out of 108 truck who is now a lieutenant in Queens. He was working in 138. And then Park Avenue in the Bronx. And the firefighters that were interviewed from that particular fire, when they were coming out of the stairwell, the attack stairwell, they were certainly faced with a fire that one hand line, they couldn't make the turn. They brought up a second, they brought up 3. They couldn't even get into the hallway because the heat was that intense. And they also realized the phenomenon that the woman from the fire apartment, she had left her apartment, walked down the hallway, was knocking on doors. She wanted someone to call 911, and another occupant on the other side of the hallway opened their door, and those 2 women were found in that apartment dead after the fire, with the woman still with the phone in her hand. The heat currents had traveled down the hallway into that apartment. So now we're starting to see things that we never saw before. And it goes on and on. Lincoln Place, Manhattan. I was the captain of 35 truck. That was Lionel Hampton's apartment. 30 firefighters went to the hospital. And it was then, it wasn't just me, but to say questions were, there has to be other ways of doing this, because we were just throwing people at that fire. Engine companies were coming out of the hallway, they were burnt. Give me another engine company. By the time they made it to the fire apartment, it took them 45 minutes to move 54 feet, and by the time they got to that fire apartment, much of the fuel had been burnt away. But we were still launching the same attack, the direct frontal attack. Marty and I were firefighters in the 108 truck in Brooklyn, and Marty was one firefighter in the house that he was saying, when you go into the apartment, you have to close the door to do the search, because if a window fails, you're giving this fire a path. And many of us fought him on that issue to say, no, if I go in that fire apartment and if I need to get out, if conditions change, I don't want anything obstructing me. So we used to chock the door. We were giving the fire a path. We didn't understand the dynamics and the currents. Most eye-opening event, Vandalia Avenue. This is Lieutenant Cavalieri, firefighter Bohan, and firefighter Bob. These 3 firefighters, they were approaching the fire apartment. They were in the hallway outside the fire apartment approaching the fire apartment to, one, close the door, maintain control of that door. These are two pictures of the front side of the building, if you will, exposure one, the A side. And the A side is the downwind side, and you'll note there's some soot stains at those windows right there. That was not the fire apartment. The fire apartment was on the exposure 3, the C side, and it was an apartment right here on the end of the building. The fire started there. The windows were not open, and the windows hadn't failed. The woman who had occupied the apartment, and the apartment was sparsely furnished. It wasn't heavily loaded with fuel. She had left the door open, exited the apartment, and when our units arrived, fire was showing at those windows. And in interviewing the firefighters, the roof firefighter, the team, one of the firefighters on the roof, he had commented that at times, and he had vented the bulkhead, by the way, the bulkhead meaning the attack stairwell roof door was open because that was our policy. Our policy was to implement vertical ventilation as soon as possible, again going back to tenement tactics, because conditions on the fire floor would lift and things like that, not understanding that if the fire was looking for a path, that was offering a path of low pressure. He was at roof level, and he was looking over the parapet wall, and he commented that at times he'd see flames blowing out, and then they would disappear back into the building. To think that maybe the wind was gusting or changing. There'd be a wind, there wasn't a wind, was the thought. But now what we've come to learn through this research, what we've learned is the apartment, even though it had a path, the apartment door was open, and once the windows failed and the fire had a path, the fire apartment was being overpressurized to the point where fire was spitting back out the window. And we're referring to that as pulsating. And that is what he was witnessing. And fire was pulsating out those windows. The reason we have soot stains there, and I'm going to give you a hallway view as well, to give you an understanding. Our 3 firefighters were right here. They came through this elevator lobby, that's a smoke stop door, and they were in this area of the hallway, approaching this fire apartment, that the apartment door had been left open. When the window failed, it was sort of in the same time frame that an occupant of this apartment either heard commotion in a hallway, wanted to hear or see what was going on, had smoke coming in the apartment. The windows of his apartment was open. He opened that door, and even though the fire had a path of travel to the attack stairwell and up out the roof bulkhead, and our firefighters wanting to launch an attack there were taking a tremendous beating. Even though that fire had a path, this gave it an additional path. It shared the vent. And the heat that traveled down this hallway overwhelmed those 3 firefighters where they stood. The medical examiner termed their death thermal shock. Have you ever heard that in the fire service before? Where this heat was so extreme, their organs shut down. And that's what happened to those 3 firefighters. Lieutenant Cavalieri, Firefighter Bohan, and Firefighter Bob. That was the hallway. They were doing their job. They were doing their job, trying to get down that hallway, to get to that door, to close that door, to maintain control, so that we could set up an attack, a direct frontal attack. We were not thinking about, do we have alternate strategies that we could launch here? To say the training, the information that we're learning, the disciplines, the size-ups, meaning what we see, what is it telling us? What do we want to look for when we get to the fire floor? If we can use a thermal imager and a door is still intact, and if the thermal imager, as we're coming down the hallway, is showing us currents, heat currents coming from around the door frame or out the peephole, is that telling us something? If we were to just come up the stairwell, arriving to the landing of the fire floor, and we were seeing smoke under pressure coming out from under that door, would that be telling us something? Under pressure. That could be telling us that the apartment door is open and we have window failure already if it's under pressure. So there's many things that we need to train and offer, not just our department, the fire service in general, of things we're going to say, because it's understanding, surviving, and fighting these fires.